Hello and welcome to Learn Jazz Live 2022. My name is Brett Pontecorvo, and I'm honored to be here with Brent Vaartstra, CEO of Learn Jazz Standards. He's a musician, he's a teacher, he's building this website for you guys to learn jazz, and we're so happy to have you today. Brent, thank you so much for putting this whole thing together. I mean, what an incredible
Woo!
experience, right?
Yeah.
It's
Thanks for moderating, Brett. Appreciate you, man.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a ton of fun. Every time we like get into a room together and we start talking about like just how to, I don't know, speed up the rate at which we're progressing, it just gets me excited because I'm seeing little ways I can change what I'm doing, and then I'm watching all of these people in the inner circle do the same thing. Like
Yeah.
they're making these tiny adjustments, they're getting just huge results. I mean, anybody who's in the inner circle sees it. So I'm kind of pumped to go through this and really just do like a deep dive on closing the gap. But I mean, we could talk all day about this. I want to make sure we get to some questions here. But first of all, I got one question coming in from Fritz, which I think is pretty important. He says, "What's the difference between composing without writing it down and improvising?" Do you have any
Okay.
thoughts on that, Brent?
Yeah. Well, there's nothing wrong with a big part of the second step in my workshop was about composing. And so, um, writing down is totally fine. You can notate your compositions. It's fine. The thing I was really trying to impress upon in the workshop, though, is that memorization is so key. It's really not about reading notation off a piece of paper when it comes to jazz. Nothing wrong with that to look back on it later after you've forgotten it, which you will forget it,
Yeah.
and refresh your memory or maybe analyze what you're doing a little bit better. So there's nothing wrong with that. It's mostly um, just, we want to memorize what's going on. Um, that I think that's the most important thing to me as far as internalizing the ideas that we have, if that
Mhm.
answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you opening that up a little bit. And the other thing too is like, it's all different parts of the same wheel, right? We got actually another question coming in from Alon that I think is kind of related to this. This one's actually on the other page, but I'll read it for you. It says, "How do we make the transition from learning licks to incorporate them seamlessly into our playing without sounding forced? How can we own the lingo?"
Yeah, very much so the same way that I
Yeah.
taught in the master class, right? So we start with learning, right? So we learned the lick. Now we're going to compose the lick, or I would say as many different licks as possible. And remember, when I was talking about composing, we were talking about in the context of a larger piece of music, like a chorus of a solo, right? You can do the same thing with licks. You could compose. You could take one idea that you learned from Sonny Rollins, and you could compose like 20, 30, 40, 50 of your own ideas that use elements of that lick, right? So that's making it our own. And then you can practice improvising. Now, I think one big thing to point out, though, is we do all this work ahead of time, learning the language and composing the language, because if we don't do that part, then we're never going to know it, right? We're never going to get to try to figure out how to experience it for ourselves. But when it comes to improvising, it's not that you shouldn't think, but it's that thinking too much can be incredibly detrimental to your progress. It's such a
Yes.
weird thing to say. And Brett, you know this too, but
Yeah.
it's almost as if when you're improvising, you should almost just try to turn that analytical side off, or this like, let's fit this idea in, because you did all that work ahead of time. So spend 30 minutes, 40 minutes, 50 minutes, an hour looping just a 2-5-1 chord progression, and there are no wrong answers, and just see what happens. Therefore, you're not trying to force anything to happen. It's just naturally, when you do all this work, those chord tones are going to come out. That altered idea is going to come out because you're going to be hearing it, right? And your muscle memory is going to be kicking in as well. So it's sort of like you have to go out on faith a little bit
Yeah.
and not try. It's like taking the training wheels off a little bit. The training wheels are the thing you composed and the lick you learned, but the improvisation is saying, I know how to pedal. Let's just go for it. So,
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. And this actually, when I was watching, I had this question come up that I think probably other people would wonder too, like if composing feels like too grandiose a statement for somebody, like is there another way we can kind of approach that that would make it an easier thing to start with? Am I asking
Um,
that question clearly?
I think so.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So I mean, so I think composing. I think it sounds intimidating, maybe because we think of it on such a on a grand level. And even in my workshop, we were only talking about 12 bars because I was doing a blues.
Yeah.
But that might be scary for someone to go, oh, I have to. Brent wants me to compose an entire chorus of a solo. Like maybe you're learning rhythm changes, and 32 bars is a lot. You
Yeah.
know, you can really when it comes to jazz and music, you should always, and it's something you talk about in your workshop, which I'm
Mhm.
really excited to get to.
Yeah.
You should
Yeah.
always set up the game to win, right? So
Yeah.
if composing an entire chorus of a solo is not going to set you up to win because you've never done that before, it seems intimidating. Then why not again, like to Allah, what his point was with licks, you could just do 4 bars, like compose 4 bars.
Mhm.
So I think maybe I don't know if that gets to the heart of what you were asking, but I think that composing doesn't have to be a scary word. It's just you're just coming up with ideas, and it could be a little bit of information, it could be a lot of information. So you always only bite off as much as you personally feel comfortable chewing on.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, no, I think that absolutely does answer it. Okay, we've got some more questions coming in here. So let's see. Um, Scott Keith wrote this one in. I think this is important too. It's like I do best when I can hear voice leading. How do I train my ear to hear the voice leadings?
how do you train? So he does best when he hears the voice leading.
I think the
How
question is how can he like ground his ears in the form? Or is that kind of what you're asking, Scott? Or that's how I'm hearing it. How do I train my ears to hear those things so that you can improvise?
Yeah. That no, I understand it. I totally
Yeah.
understand it. Yeah, so, I mean, this is well, I mean, one thing our inner circle members who are here right now will know that we do this a lot. We work a lot on chord tone mapping and guide tone mapping exercises, as well as, like, approach tones and other more complicated things, but what we always do with these exercises is we voice lead them together so that you're
Yeah.
connecting chord tones in a stepwise fashion where there's an actual melodic movement rather than just chord tones, chord tones, chord tones, right? So a lot of sometimes people ask, well, why are we doing this? Like, what's the point of doing this? Well, A, you're getting the chord tones down, but B, you're practicing connecting them together. And it's not just your muscle memory you're building your ear
Yeah.
to hear those sounds and what they sound like. So whenever we want to hear voice leading better, go back to the basics a little bit more, right? What's the basic kind of voice leading? Well, go up one chord tone and let's connect to the next chord with the nearest chord tone. What does that sound like? What does it sound like when I resolve to a strong chord tone like the third or the seventh, right?
Mhm.
um so all of this is like it's not just about knowing information, it's about hearing information just as much. So if you want to train your ear to hear voice leading, go back and compose for yourself as many different ways to voice lead, going up one chord to the next chord. The more you hear the stuff that you're practicing and playing, the more you will recognize it. Just like the more I hear Greek being spoken, the more I recognize it because I've heard that word so many times. I didn't know it for a long time, but I've heard that word enough. Now I know what it means, or I know the essence of what someone's talking about. So it's the same thing.
Yep. Yeah. The language parallel is just so accurate because you could say even right now that we're improvising as we're speaking to each other, right? Like,
100%. And
oh,
everybody uses that parallel, but it's
yeah,
because it really it's what it is, it's
yeah,
just a different kind of language, that's all.
right. And so
So,
far, me and you have made up no new words.
we
We'll
have
see
made
what
up
happens towards the end of the interview. But the point being, right? Like, it's
I do
all
make up
language that
words
has,
though
right.
sometimes.
Of course. Of course.
People email me about it. They're like, "Hey, I heard on your podcast you made up there's this word that's not grammatically correct." Grammar,
Oh,
please.
goodness. Oh man, yeah, it's a thing that happens. Stefano actually has a question that I think is interesting too. He's a couple down from Scott, but it just said I understand I should switch off my rational mind, but then how I don't get lost in the harmony, I do get lost. heavily.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So is it? I think what he's asking is how do I not get lost when I'm playing
Yeah.
a
Or when
solo?
you turn your rational mind off, how do you not get lost in the form?
Got you.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so there's so many answers to that question. So I'm trying to think of like how can I distill this into its simplicity. So a lot of what this is developing your inner time feel and your
Yeah.
ears. Like it's almost like I can't just say one thing because it's like it's about feeling time, because if you're relying on thinking about the harmony constantly, but you're not feeling the time properly, absolutely. As soon as you forget about the harmony and you're not feeling the time, you're not feeling that forward progression. So that's sort of like automatically you're handicapping yourself.
Right.
Um, so listen to as many recordings of the song as possible, go through the solos and be marking off where you're at. Like where are we in the solo? Be mindfully listening, right? So practice listening to records, I think, is one thing that you can definitely do. Yeah, with the jazz standard, you keep getting lost on, right?
Mhm.
Because the more you listen to that over and over again, the more you're going to be like, okay, I know where we are. Even though you're not playing, it's still a level down from there. Um, I think other things that you can consider doing is, try breaking your improvisation up a little bit. Like improvise for like 4 bars and then purposefully don't improvise, and maybe do it with a backing track so that you're like purposefully stopping and listening to the harmony and continuing off of that. Also on top of that, like honestly, the more you know the tune, the less likely this is going to happen. The more you know the melody super, super well, like you can, it's playing in your dreams, you know, the
Mhm.
the more likely you're less likely to get lost. But a lot of it is practicing, feeling internal time. And I know that's not like there's a lot more deeper we could go with that answer, but that at least gets you a little bit started, I suppose. Has to feel, it has to be so internalized that it just feels natural. So
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I remember going through a whole period of time in college listening to solos, watching a chord chart. Like just watching the PDF, listening. I
yeah.
have this vivid memory of listening to Brad Meldau playing Solar, listening to a chord chart, and also just being like, "Where are you? Like, what's happening?" But
Yeah.
but it starts to like you start to like lock in a way where the all of the planes are happening.
Yeah.
Um,
And you're
you know,
training your ear to listen for the harmonic changes that are happening.
yep,
Even if
yep,
you couldn't say, that's the 5 chord or the 4 chord, you're hearing something change.
yep,
So you are
yep.
hearing it. Yeah.
Yeah. This is a great question from Astrophotoid, which I mean, I just feel like we have to just say that is a great username. A
Love it.
plus work. When I try improvising, I end up playing scales and arpeggios, and it sounds really dull. Any tricks to break out of that habit?
Yes, lots of them. So, number one, keep watching the workshops and learn jazz live. You're going to get a ton of great ideas. There's some that are very improv specific on the more granular level, like how do you make scales and arpeggios more interesting. Check out Jens Larsson's coming up,
Mhm.
and then ask as many questions as you want during his Q&A. So that's just for what we can do today, right? But okay, scales and arpeggios are, again, they're important fundamentals to work on. They're not music though, right? Arpeggios, chord tones are a lot closer to what we're going for with jazz, but they're not music, right? So this is where that is the heart of why we learn jazz language and jazz solos and jazz lines. The arpeggios and the scales are there to help us understand what makes these, especially arpeggios, what makes these lines work so well, because oftentimes great jazz musicians are resolving to those strong chord tones, which is what's making those chord changes pop.
Yeah.
So getting used to doing that is important, but that's why we do have to spend so much time with the LR the LCI practice strategy. I have too many practice strategies. The LCI practice strategy, because we want to be learning that language and internalizing actual language, not just arpeggios and scales.
Yeah.
So one, lots of great ideas coming up about how to make scales and arpeggios more musical. Two, that's why you need to focus a lot of your time on learning the language and then creating your own language and then improvising your own language. There's a lot to be said about music theory. There's a lot to be said about understanding what you're playing. 100%. But then there's even more to be said about just starting to talk, you know? You have to start talking, right?
Mhm.
So, yes, that's my short answer for you. Good question though.
Yeah, yeah. Something I was noticing when you were improvising is a lot of your stuff was rooted in the blues scale, which I guess is also rooted in blues language, right?
Yeah.
Like, can you just talk a little bit about that? Like, you went right for it when you were improvising, and it created something that immediately sounded cohesive. Like, you could
Yeah.
have gone a different direction. Why did you go there? And how can people use a similar tactic to make the like composing part of this process a little bit easier for them?
Yeah. So I think I improvised in this in the workshop. I played an
Was it the
etude
composing? The
and
composing?
composing. Yeah. So
Maybe
yeah,
that's what I
yeah.
was
So
hearing.
yeah, that's true. There's a lot of bluesy stuff in there, a little
Yeah.
bit of bebop, but mostly blues.
Hmm.
Yeah, so I mean that's where, it comes down to honestly, well, using like actual theoretical tools,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So using the chord tones and trying to target those chord tones, but also like, yeah, what are some bluesy things that we can use? Like the pentatonics are a great thing. That's where scales are a great thing. But
Hmm.
scales without mixing them with language are just scales, right?
Yep.
Even more
Absolutely.
musical scales like pentatonics and stuff like that.
Hmm.
So yeah, I don't know. Like, I think if I remember correctly, when I was just composing that on the spot, I think I was just going for what sounded good to me, like what
Yeah.
sounded good. And over top of a blues, I like to hear that. That's what I like to hear.
Right.
Does that answer your question, or is
Yeah,
there?
no, it does. Well, when I was listening to it, I was like, okay, so you kind of started with something you knew would work.
Oh,
Like
oh yeah,
you
yeah,
weren't trying to like reinvent the wheel. You weren't trying to be out of the box. You took something that was blues language from you've probably listened to 100 and who knows
yeah,
how many different blues solos, and you were like, I know this will work, and that's what you played.
right.
And that was enough.
But I
It
didn't
sounds
have but and yeah, that is enough. And I didn't
yeah,
have to do that though. I could have decided that's what the composing part is all about.
yeah.
That's different from improvising. Improvising is reacting, composing, planning. I could have planned specifically like, "Oh, you know what? I always start with that lick.
Mhm.
Let's compose a
Mhm.
different way to start it. Start
Right.
solo," right?
There's one more question I want to make sure we get to that just came in from Aisha Wilson. Often when I try to improvise, it sounds pretty good, but my rhythm is boring. How can I use rhythm to take my solos to the next level?
Oh, I'm looking for it
It's
there it
close
is.
to the bottom. Yeah.
Okay, often when I try to improvise, it sounds pretty good, but my rhythm is boring. How can I use rhythm to take solos to the next level? Aisha, first of all, you need to check out Diego Maldonado's
Yes.
workshop coming up. Um, it is so packed with value. Like he's a drummer. He's literally like showing you what to do on his body the entire workshop, and it sort of will blow your mind. He has some really good ideas there. But to give you a little sneak peek, one thing that you can do, well, he sort of talks about this a little bit, but one thing that you can do is we often talk about what's called motivic development in jazz, which is like you play a simple melodic idea and then you try to repeat that melodic idea, even if it's over a different chord,
Yeah.
and just adjusting it and then developing it. But you're still trying to, you take this motif, this idea, and you develop it. But oftentimes, a lot of us who are harmonic and melodic players think about that harmonically and melodically, exactly what I just said. But what if you just started with rhythms instead? So you went through the form of a blues or a jazz standard you're working on, and you specifically mapped out rhythmic motifs like,
Yeah.
okay, and then you could switch it up the next line. Okay, so plan out the rhythms that you want to do. Maybe listen to some records to oh, I like that rhythm that so and so played. What is that rhythm? Okay, plan it out over this 8 bars. Then go back and add melodic notes and do whatever you want to do to play the chord changes. So compose that way. Be very intentional about what rhythms you want to play. That's one thing that you can do to make your solos more interesting. So yes,
Yeah. Um, are we at time?
we are at time. Maybe one more question.
Let's see here if we have them. Somebody asked what your favorite tool is for slowing things down. I don't know if
Oh,
you have a favorite one, but
any of them really work. You can even go onto YouTube,
yeah,
if you're listening to something on YouTube, like a record or something like that, a tune or a solo. I think they even have tools on YouTube to slow things down. But I think
yeah.
common ones that people use is Amazing Slowdowner
Mhm.
and Transcribe is another one. Those are great like apps and software that you could use. Um,
There's another one that I just saw called Songmaster that will take a transcription you slowed down through the cycle of fourths,
oh, really?
which is very cool.
Okay.
Anyway, so but I actually use the Amazing Slowdowner for or have been for a while, but those and Band in a Box 2 is good as well. But that's the new kid on the street that I just heard of recently, the Songmaster.
Nice.
Um, yeah. All right, man. Well, dude, thanks for answering all these questions. This is awesome to kind of get a little bit more insight to like the underpinnings of what you're thinking.
Yeah, and if anybody else has any other questions that maybe they didn't get answered, go to my workshop page. I can't say that all the speakers will be doing this, but go to the work. I personally, if you go to my workshop page and leave a comment, all today I will be responding to those questions in text. So feel free to do that if that's helpful for you.
Yeah. All right, friends. Thank you guys so much for being here. Don't forget to check out the rest of our live workshops, the rest of our live Q&As for Learn Jazz Live 2022. Have an awesome rest of your day, guys, and we'll see you later today.